Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I want to give a rundown of what exactly the ketogenic diet is. The current recommendation is that we eat 50% of our macronutrients as carbohydrates, 30% as protein, and 20% as fat. So you see that the fat intake is very low in the recommendations. These recommendations are based on studies that were done in 1950s trying to link higher fat intake with cardiovascular disease. The biggest example of a research study that influenced these recommendations was Ansel Keys. He did a 7-country study. He had data on 22 countries, and he wanted to link countries that were increasing, that had higher fat diets, was there higher rates of cardiovascular disease. There was only out of the 22, 7 that fit. So he excluded all the other ones and kept those 7, which gave the impression that there was a correlation. As fat was going up in the 7 countries, there was higher cardiovascular disease. It was a flawed study, and it's actually, the correlation was as people were increasing cigarette smoking consumption in the 50s, cardiovascular disease was increasing. So there's a lot of factors. You could even see also a correlation in the study. The more a country was industrialized, the more the cardiovascular diseases were increasing. Yet this is why the recommendations, and this is what the American Heart Foundation bases their whole foundation on, is to villainize fats. Even though the present research that is coming out is indicating that cholesterol isn't causing the cardiovascular disease like we thought it was. Fat is not causing cardiovascular disease, and the recommendations are not changing because the Heart Foundation has a lot invested in these research that they basically financed. So if they come out looking stupid because all the research they've done in the past 50 years has been wrong, that's pretty much going to be a huge embarrassment for them. And they have a lot of influence. The ketogenic diet completely flips the recommendations on their head. So in the ketogenic diet, only 5% of our macronutrients are taken as carbohydrates, 25% is taken as protein, and 70% of a ketogenic diet is fats. So you will want to be really sure about the truth on fats before you start a ketogenic diet. So what exactly do we eat on a ketogenic diet? All right, so let's give a little bit of a rundown of what we don't eat. Since it's a severely restricted carbohydrate diet, we're cutting out the grains, cutting out the bread, pasta, rice, juice, colas, and any processed foods. So by cutting out all that, we're able to severely restrict our carbohydrate intake. The 5% that we are allowed to use is mainly fibrous vegetables, kale, spinach, Brussels sprouts, you name it. As long as the vegetables are low in carb and aren't starchy, then you can have ample amounts in a ketogenic diet. You have to watch out a bit with the fruits. You can have some, but fruits, especially the ones that we eat now, are genetically modified and they're made to be bigger and sweeter. So you can really quickly pile on the amount of grams of carbs that you're taking in a day by eating fruits. What I usually do is I consume berries, about a cupful, which is 10 grams, and I do that every few days when I want to, but it's not like a staple. I don't eat fruits every day, but I do eat a lot of vegetables and a lot of greens. The vitamins, the minerals that you get in fruits, you also get in vegetables. There's just as many essential minerals and vitamins in a diet that has plenty of greens and fibrous vegetables as compared to fruits. So we also consume a moderate portion of nuts, Not too much because they're high in calories, so you can really, overdo it with the nuts. But nuts are great for a ketogenic diet. They have protein and they have fats. There's some nuts that are a little bit higher in carbohydrates compared to others. Macadamia nuts has awesome amount of fat and relatively low amounts of carbohydrates, so they're great. Also, we eat a lot of fat, obviously, so we get our fats from all sorts of cuts of meat. So there's no limitations on the kinds of meats that we can eat. Pork chops, chicken, fish, lamb, you name it, you can eat it, even bacon. So there's no limitation on the meat, and we get a lot of the animal fats this way. We also consume coconut oil, olive oil, avocado oil. We can add butter into our diet, not margarine. Margarine is not good. We can add butter, we can add cream to our coffee. What else? So we went through the meats that we can eat. We went through the restriction in the carbohydrates that we should avoid. We talked about the fruits and we talked about the vegetables. Obviously, there's a lot more stuff that you can consume. I didn't just name, the few limited things. There's tons of great recipes that you can check, buy books at Chapters, where my bookstore is. There's tons of keto recipe books, but you can get a load of awesome recipes also online by just Googling, keto recipes. Obesity and diabetes. So calories don't play that much of an importance, or it's not as important as we thought. It's not so simple, obesity. It's not really just calories in and calories out. There's some people that are hard gainers. They're eating tons of calories and they're just not putting on weight. And other people are restricting calories. They're trying to be super active and they're still struggling with their weight. So while calories do play a certain, to a certain extent, the real factor for obesity is hormones. It's hormones that are causing obesity. And what we intake as food affects hormones. And carbohydrates affect insulin. So insulin is one of the major causes of obesity. When you consume carbohydrates, there's a very drastic spike in your insulin. And when insulin is spiked and there's sugar in your blood, it's going to try and open up the cells and send the sugar into the cells. Now, if you're eating too many carbs, then at one point the energy expenditure for these cells, they're already met. So the cell doesn't really need any more energy. So any of those carbs in the presence of insulin will end up switching and going to be stored as fat, because once you have higher elevated blood glucose when you're eating a lot of carbs, the insulin will be used to bring it down to baseline. So it's going to shove it in the cells, and if there's no room, it's going to shove it into the fat. So obesity is a hormonal issue. It's not about calories. All right, that's the most important thing. Jason Fung, you can see him on YouTube. He's everywhere. Just punch in Jason Fung. He's written a book about obesity and that it's a hormonal issue. So by cutting out the sugar on a ketogenic diet, what you're doing is you're creating within your body an environment that is very, very low in insulin. Protein does spike insulin to a certain extent, but it's not comparable to carbohydrates. And it's for sure that there's foods that are carbohydrates. Everyone probably knows about the glycemic index. So there are sugars that spike the insulin a lot more drastically, and there's some that spike it less. But compared to protein, even good complex carbs still spike insulin quite a bit. Fat is almost neutral when it comes to insulin. There's no response and there's no spikes with a fat diet, which is another reason not only that there's low carbohydrates, but there's high fats that don't really spike your insulin, creating an environment that is low in insulin and does not promote fat storage. Also, the only way that you can start burning fat is if there is insulin at baseline. If your insulin has spiked because of your breakfast, your lunch, your supper, the snacks in between, and their carbohydrates, no matter how busy you are during the day, the body can't turn and metabolize fats until the insulin's return to baseline. Basically, what the way that most people eat, we're never at baseline until we're sleeping. And that's leading to a large part in the problem with obesity and diabetes. So when you're doing a higher carb diet that's recommended, you are basically a glucose burner. You're supplying your body with glucose. That's the energy that your body is using. If you're supplying it with too much energy, it's being stored as fat. But with a ketogenic diet, with the severe restrictions in carbohydrates, the body does not have access to glucose. We do have glucose stored in our liver and in our muscle as glycogen, which is glucose and water. And once we start restricting the carbohydrates, our body within 1 to 3 days will run through the glycogen stores. And if we're not supplying any more than 5% of our macronutrients, then the body turns around and has no choice but to start metabolizing fat. When fat is metabolized, it is turned into a ketone. And a ketone is a fuel source that can fuel your whole body. It's a cleaner and it's a more efficient fuel than glucose. That's why it's called a keto diet or a ketogenic diet, because it induces the state of ketosis that occurs during a restriction in carbohydrates. The other thing that's great about a ketogenic diet is that the higher fat and the moderate amount of protein is extremely filling. So it really helps with hunger and cravings, and keeps you really satiated for a very, very long time. Carbohydrates and diets that are higher in carbohydrates, especially the junk food and the processed sugars, really mess up your hormones that control your hunger. There's leptin and there's ghrelin, and these things become all out of whack. So you're getting cravings, you just ate 3 hours ago and you're hungry again, and you're always running after your hunger, and you're always running after energy by refueling with more and more carbs. With the ketogenic diet, you completely stabilize your hunger hormones, your appetite is completely under control. Also, because you're adapting yourself to burning fat, when you're not eating, now is when your body is tapping into your fat storage. So if you're going a long time without eating on a ketogenic diet, you're not starving. Your body is being supplied with ample amount of stored fuel. And that's what fat is made to be. That's the purpose of fat. It's made to be stored, and when food is not available or restricted, then we're supposed to tap into those stores. But the way our recommendations are, and the recommendations for 3 meals a day and snacking, it will never allow us to really tap into those fat storage. So do you want to be a glucose burner or do you want to be a fat burner? I prefer being a fat burner. The ketogenic diet also has a lot of health benefits. You see, insulin resistance is a huge problem. It causes prediabetes and diabetes too. What exactly is insulin resistance? Well, think of it this way. If you're an alcoholic and you're constantly bombarding your body with alcohol, you create a resistance to alcohol, and it requires you to drink more and more to get the desired effect. The same with a person that's abusing drugs. If a person is abusing drugs, they develop a resistance to the effect of that drug, and they require more and more of that drug to have the desired effect. Insulin works the same way. Insulin has a job to do. It's to open up the cell and supply energy. But if you're giving too much energy in the form of carbohydrates, that means that there is way too much insulin being secreted. Eventually, the cell itself becomes resistant to insulin and it no longer opens up. Then the pancreas ends up secreting more insulin. So now you have an environment where there's tons of insulin, and when you get into diabetes 2, Now you have tons of sugar that's knocking at the door of the cell to go in, but the cell is completely insulin resistant and is no longer responding to insulin. Our conventional way of treating that is to give more insulin and to force that cell open. It makes no sense. It's like giving a drug addict more drugs or giving an alcoholic more alcohol so that they stay stoned and drunk. We're doing this with diabetes too. Instead, to reverse the resistance, we need to create an environment that is very low in insulin. And the only way that you can do that is by a ketogenic diet, by a severe restriction in your carbohydrates, where protein barely causes a spike in insulin compared to the glucose, and fat is pretty much neutral. And because you are full longer, you're eating less, and you're able to go much longer without eating. So the ketogenic diet produces an environment that is low in insulin and can reverse the insulin resistance. We treat diabetes 2 like it's a chronic and progressive illness, and it's not. It's chronic because we're chronically eating sugar, and it's progressive because we're dealing with the high blood sugar, but we're not dealing with the actual insulin resistance. Also, there's many other benefits to a ketogenic diet. I wrote them down, so that's why I'm staying here, not to forget. Blood pressure can go down. Ketosis has been a treatment for epilepsy for hundreds of years. It was a treatment up until the 1950s, but then pharmaceuticals came in and anticonvulsants, and doctors started prescribing that. But before they developed anticonvulsant medication, patients were doing a lot of fasting, and they were doing carb restrictions, and they were putting themselves in a state of ketosis, which greatly reduced the seizures that they were having. It's still done to a certain extent in certain areas in the United States for children that are resistant to all the drugs. Doctors, some of them are putting these children on a ketogenic diet, and it sometimes greatly impacts the severity of their epilepsy. Any neurological problem seems to have a marked improvement with a ketogenic diet. Bipolar, ADHD, anxiety, unipolar depression. There's interesting research into Alzheimer's and dementia and the effects of a ketogenic diet with intermittent fasting. There's also a strong anti-inflammatory effect. So we all know about the omegas. The omega-3 are strong anti-inflammatories. So a diet high in fat has a strong anti-inflammatory effect. And we know that most diseases have an inflammatory factor to it. Most illnesses are an inflammatory disorder. So having a high-fat diet that has an anti-inflammatory effect can improve a myriad of illnesses and disorders. Also, there's a lot of study with a ketogenic diet on cancer. You see, cancer cells thrive on glucose. A ketogenic diet that offers a severely restricted carbohydrate intake actually can starve the cancer cells. It's already being applied in some areas in the States with traditional radiation and chemotherapy. Patients are improving their outcomes with cancer by adding a ketogenic diet to their treatment. So a lot of research is out there, and a lot of research is being done on cancer and ketogenic diets. The body runs amazing on ketones. It's known to have increased cognitive capabilities, increased clarity, and cancer cells just don't work well with ketones. So there's so many amazing benefits to a ketogenic diet. On the link below, I'll put all the links of the research about dietary fats not being bad for your heart. I'll put the links about possible cancer research, links on bipolar disorder. Just check out all the links below. It'll give you tons of information on the stuff that I spoke about in this video. Thanks a lot, guys, and I hope you subscribe to my video. I almost forgot something very important. If you are a diabetic too, and you are on insulin, you can't start a ketogenic diet without first talking to your doctor. You see, the low insulin environment that is created with a ketogenic diet due to the carb restrictions. If you're restricting your carbs compared to before, you might need a lot less insulin. And if you're taking the same dose of insulin, it's like an overdose of insulin for the amount of sugar that's in your blood. That can cause a state of hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is when your blood sugar crashes below the normal level. It's extremely dangerous. It's a medical emergency. It can cause coma and even death. So if you're on insulin, don't start a ketogenic diet right away. Talk with your doctor because your insulin might need to be readjusted. There's a lot of other medications since a ketogenic diet has some effect on the way our body processes sodium through the kidneys. So I think it's prudent that if you're interested in a ketogenic diet, to please talk with your doctor and your pharmacist, look at the medication that you're going through and see if there's any adjustments or any contraindications to this diet. Now I'm done. Like I said before, give me a thumbs up if you like this video, subscribe below, and I'll keep on pouring out information on ketogenic diet and try and give you as much links about the research that's happening now and in the future. All right, guys, see you later.